Durkheim, sacred. For Durkheim, sacred is the essential to the formation of what he calls moral communities, or moieties, if you're familiar with that word, is how it's translated sometimes. He takes the sacred as a distillation of collective ideals. The sacred is something that is over and above us, that seems to, we feel ourselves to be represented in it, our highest ideals, our sense of being part of a group are expressed through the sacred. So the sacred is the distillation of collective ideals in the formation of collective communities. The thing that is sacred, the object, whatever it might be, is largely irrelevant for Durkheim, right? A rock, a tree, a spring, a pebble, a piece of wood, a house, a word, a value, a room, a building, whatever it is can be sacred. Anything can be sacred, right? Because it is merely representing a collectivity to itself. It's representing a moral community. It's representing shared ideals. So he sees Pickering is a well-known Durkheim scholar. Pickering talks about, says that the sacred-profane dichotomy is not just a descriptive term, but is actually a causal force, a causal factor underlying social life. And this fades out in people's readings of Durkheim until the kind of rediscovery of Durkheim and cultural Durkheim, as some people are late Durkheim, in the late 90s, early 2000s. So the contrast between the sacred and the profane, this dichotomy, is variable. It's the fact of it is universal, right? So whatever is sacred in a given society for a given group, at a university, at your university versus mine, whatever, varies, right? But the fact that something called the sacred exists appears to be universal. And I think, we're not into universal claims generally in sociology, but I think this is one we can probably stick with. So the fact of it is universal, while its contents, its forms might be variable. Okay. So something becomes sacred by virtue of the orientations of actors to it, that is, how they treat it, how they orient to it, how they relate themselves to it, and to the kinds of social relations that are organized around it. Okay? So there's an individual and collective dimension to the sacred in Durkheim's conception. Okay. So ritual is his way of telling us and talking to us about the sacred. And so ritual is organized around and oriented to the sacred, whatever that is. So that's most evident in religious ritual. I think about Catholic ritual, any ritual, right? The sacred objects, sacred spaces, or rituals are organized and oriented to think of just the spatial layout of a church, right? Is organized around the sacred. For Durkheim, ritual, and he's explicitly talking about religious ritual, right? The book is called The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. I prefer if it was called The Elementary Forms of Collective Life, because I think that's more meaningful and the correct description of what the book does. But ritual both demonstrates and generates solidarity. So it has this, ritual is in this interesting sort of a loop. So I engage in a ritual as a demonstration of what I believe to be sacred, but the ritual also has the effect of reproducing that sacred, right? And generating bonds between us. It doesn't need to be formal or institutional, right? The sacred doesn't need to be, or ritual, sorry, doesn't need to be formal, institutional, doesn't need to be high Anglican Catholic ceremony. The question we can ask when we're looking at ritual is to say, what is the sacred that a particular ritual is oriented to? By looking at the makeup of a ritual, of any kind of ritual activity, we can begin to figure out what the sacred is for that group that is invested in this ritual, right? That goes, again, beyond the boundaries of religion, right? It's not just about religious observance. And then the sort of Durkheimian kind of idea about social pathology is that, breaches are instructive. Ritual failures are instructive. We learn when things don't work, right? I'll touch on that in relation to Goffman as well. Okay. So to get at the sacred, though, we can't just have ritual. We also have to have belief. Individuals have to feel compelled, have to feel themselves moved, represented, right? So neither belief in, if you read your book 2 of the elementary forms carefully, right, you'll see neither belief or ritual are primary, right? They mutually reinforce one another. There's chicken and the egg is infinite here, right? We can't say one comes before the other. As Mary Douglas, who's very Durkheimian in her thinking, she talks about the risk of ritualism. That is a ritual that absent belief, right? So just a kind of a going through the motions of ritual. Likewise, having a belief that finds no traction in ritual, that has no ritual instantiation, is just purely personal, right? It needs some sort of ritual, meaning more than one, right, involved. And then through ritual, through the kind of combination of ritual in the constitution of the sacred, Durkheim talks about kind of what he calls mana, power, force, and he treats this as moral force. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. Okay, on to some Canadian content. Goffman, if you don't know, he was Canadian, right? It's good. It's always a good thing to hook students in, maybe, I don't know. But from Manitoba, so that's a whole other thing. So Goffman, you know, so sort of discovered a realm of social life that was always already there, but figured out how to describe and analyze it in ways that had not been done previously, right? He took the absolutely ordinary taken for granted and subjected it to scrutiny, right? That's the kind of Goffmanian method. He gives us this term in, you know, the very last essay of his life, or the very last presentation he gives as the president of the ASA, his famous essay from 1983 called The Interaction Order. You see he dies in 82, but it doesn't get published till 83. And he coins this term, the interaction order, and this essay is the kind of summary of the basic method, basic mode of analysis he tried to use for his entire career. And so he calls this the interaction order. And the interaction order is a negotiated order produced by co-present persons. We, right now, are co-present. We're physically co-present, right? I'm temporarily co-present, let's say, with folks online. We're kind of in some dual way, physically, semi-digitally co-present. But us here in this room, we're physically co-present. That's what was of intrinsic interest to Goffman. It's endogenously organized. So it can be analyzed without reference to anything that happens outside of the interactions. Outside of the order produced by the interactions of people who are co-present. It's so we're organizing it, we're sustaining it. It's intersubjectively sustained. We make that order between us, right? That's a case in a bedroom or a boardroom. It's the case whether it's in a riot or a restaurant. Okay? Goffman would say all of those have interaction orders, and they're all produced by the people who inhabit them. It's a universal feature of human co-presence, but it is not everywhere identical. Again, a similar kind of formal similarity here to Durkheim's idea. So Goffman wants us to treat it as having relative autonomy from broader contexts. It's both fragile and enduring, easily ruptured and relatively easily repaired. So again, the idea that disruption of some kind to the interaction order can also be instructive then, this idea of social pathology. Okay. The assumptions built into Goffman's sort of idea as around that sort of my initial assumption that I said, the paramount reality of the life world. He also says what uniquely transpires, something unique transpires when human beings are co-present. That does not happen when they're not co-present. Right? And so that's fundamental. Co-presence is central to all of our everyday lives, classrooms, everyday relationships, family, friends. And then we don't want to mistake co-presence and group life, which is a very common kind of category error that people make, I think, in analysis. Group assumes some sort of already bounded or bondedness, whereas co-presence simply refers to the fact of bodies being in the same place. It doesn't assume that this thing is a group, right? That there's an entity already formed by virtue of co-presence. Okay. And then sort of to kind of pull Goffman a little bit closer to Durkheim again, all interaction orders, he says, are moral orders. There are sort of moral commands, moral demands on people by virtue of being in interaction orders. Right? And to get at this, he treats interaction as ritualized. Right? So this is the idea that I started with, the kind of basic premise that all social activity has ritual dimensions. And the person's whose that's from is still out of my head. Meaning and moral order. Okay. Wuthnow. There you go. Yes, there you go. It's in that. Got it. Thank you. So Goffman coins the term interaction ritual. Right. So again, here he's borrowing from capital H, he, Durkheim. Right. The interaction order is highly ritualized. So interaction order, the order we produce, is highly ritualized, and that order is upheld by interaction ritual. So this is the ritual order of everyday life worlds. We can use it to analyze, interactions between, I don't know, Donald Trump and the UN, really high level sort of thing, but we can also just talk about it in very mundane, ordinary ways like us here now, like a classroom, like eating dinner this evening with your friends or your family. Interaction ritual both demonstrates and generates solidarity. This is the Durkheimian sort of loop, right? Interaction rituals demonstrate solidarity. So I'll talk about how that happens in a moment with some just brief examples from Goffman. Interaction ritual is organized around, it's a ritual, so it's organized around and oriented to the sacred. But the sacred now is not necessarily on the same scale or, you know, of the same significance maybe as the way Durkheim invited us to think about it. Goffman wants us to think about it in a very simple sort of in a very everyday sort of way, mundane, if you like. Again, the breach is instructive. In Goffman's language, he calls them situational improprieties. And so an analytic means to access the sacred in everyday life. So we don't have to go to high ritual, high rites, high ceremonial, big ceremonies, right, to understand the sacred. He says an analytic means to access the sacred in everyday life is to observe ritual. Just observe ritual dimensions of everyday activity and you learn what's sacred, right? So in this room, there's obviously something about the sanctity of knowledge. Everyone's orienting to somebody who's speaking, right? There's speaking rights. I'm a ratified speaker in Goffman's language here, right? Goffman would say there's ritual elements. This has the characteristic of an interaction ritual that's demonstrating something in this room is sacred, or there are sacred things circulating in the room by virtue of how this is organized. Not saying any individual is necessarily sacred, right? Although Goffman would. Okay, so Goffman's interaction ritual and the sacred, it's threaded through his work, right? So very obviously in stigma is a symbolic ascription of a profane identity, right? The sacred and profane, right? So stigma is simply a profane identity. It's the opposite of sacred. So you could observe how stigmatized identities are treated in interaction, and you would see that there's all sorts of rules around how one ought to treat a stigmatized identity, right? These things shift over time, obviously, right? Civil inattention in his work on behavior in public spaces is a very good way into this as well, which he talks about the slightest of talks civil inattention. That is when you pass a stranger on a street, he says you don't ignore one another because then you just bump into each other. You are clearly acknowledge one another, but you give one another just enough recognition. And he calls this the slightest of interpersonal rituals. He says this is like the thinnest ritual you could get is the way that you pass a stranger and you give each other space. And he says this instantiates a bond, however thin, threadbare almost, of solidarity, right? Because you're not punching each other, right? Worst case, right? So this is a mundane expression of what I've called soft solidarity. We can think of, so people have, then we can think about this more broadly. It doesn't have to be just about stranger interactions. It can also be about Goffman's extensive work on face, which I was studying incivilities for about 5 years before I discovered there's a whole field called politeness research. It's an entire field that has dozens of journals, barely exists in North America, is quite big in Eastern Europe, China, Japan, South Asia, Iran, Greece for some reason, parts of Latin America. It doesn't barely exists in North America. The entire field is based on Goffman's essay on face work. The entire field is literally based on one single Goffman essay, right? And it's a huge, huge field. It includes people from primatology, animal ecology, Brown and Stephen Levinson, right, is huge in the world of primatology and animal cognition and things like this, right? So it's a very interesting sort of a field. So what Goffman does is he treats the individual as sacred. So interaction ritual is organized around the sanctity of the individual, face saving being a good example, right? So interaction ritual in everyday life expresses and upholds the sacred status of persons, of individuals. Okay, and then at a very different scale, we have Jeffrey Alexander's strong program in cultural sociology. No, oh my goodness. Definitely don't want that to happen. Okay, that's all right. Okay, and what Alexander does is focuses on symbolic dimensions of social processes, right? Foreground symbolic dimensions of social life. So this, there's kind of a lineage, or there's a range of people kind of working in this area. Michel Lamont and colleagues have been doing work on symbolic boundaries, right? Really interesting work. There's, a recent history of work on the marked and unmarked, whether around identities, but also thinking about marked and unmarked fields of study, marked and unmarked activities that people might be engaged in, which has a homologous structure to the sacred and profane. And then the main thing that the strong program in cultural sociology asserts is that culture has relative autonomy, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment. That's implicit in Durkheim in some ways in his later work. Alexander and Smith make it very explicit. A lot of Alexander's more recent work is very much about this. Most of the field of cultural sociology now treats culture as, if you want the language, like as an independent variable, as a causal force in social life. which is not to say that things like the economy, politics are not important, but rather as a mode of analysis, what happens when we treat culture as a causal force. And the kind of classic essay on this that's kind of cited in the field is Anne Kane's essay from 1991. Okay, so taking this idea then that culture has autonomy, relative autonomy or analytic autonomy, right? Categories of the sacred and profane are fundamental organizing categories in everyday practice, and that should say, and in at a macro scale, in kind of political life, in social movements, in political organizing, in how leaders speak, right? How world leaders speak. Again, Trump's speech in the UN might be a test case of this. Within Alexander's sort of work and kind of influenced by liberal political philosophy, I would say solidarity and justice are only analytically separable. They're in practice, they're almost impossible to disentangle. And a very easy kind of thought experiment you can do is, for whom do you seek justice? You seek justice for those with whom you feel solidarity. You're not too bothered by injustices committed against people with whom you do not feel solidarity, right? So solidarity and justice as concepts, we can disentangle them as concepts, but in our orientations to the world, we tend to treat them as fully intertwined, right? We seek justice for those with whom we feel solidarity. We're moved by injustices committed against people with whom we. So if we're moved by an injustice, it suggests we feel solidarity with those who are being treated unjustly, right? And then the cultural structures thing, I'm not going to worry about here. Okay, so treating culture as causal. This means affording, like I've said, analytic primacy or relative autonomy to symbolic structures, of which the sacred is the central one, right? So in Alexander's work, later developed in work on the civil sphere, which is a sort of a macro level empirical cum normative theory that treats binary discourse of the sacred and profane as the central organizing principle of this thing called the civil sphere. The civil sphere is a sphere where the core people, where our core concern is solidarity, right? The economic sphere, our core concern is money. The political sphere, our core concern is power. In the civil sphere, our core concern is solidarity, right? So those who are members of the civil sphere are those with whom we feel solidarity. In the Canadian civil sphere, for example, we could say the historical exclusion of a variety of groups from the Canadian civil sphere happens, and then over time there's a process by which incorporation, various ways that groups come to be perceived as civil, right? In order to become part of this civil sphere. And Alexander sees this as an extension of solidarity. So treating the civil sphere as an autonomous sphere of social life where solidarity expands through processes of boundary expansion, civil repair, and civil inclusion. Okay, so that's a real Cole's notes of the sort of Alexander stuff. So then, the sacred is kind of a way for us then maybe to thread some of this. So I'm going to leave Durkheim as a background figure, right? Who is a fundamental influence on both Goffman and Alexander's work. So, so some things then we might do is like think about distinctions between cultural sociology or civil sphere theory. So Alexander's sort of work and Goffman. Civil sphere theory, cultural sociology is concerned with discourse around the binary discourse of civil society, binary discourses of sacred and profane, of democratic, anti-democratic, openness versus secrecy, rationality versus emotion, a series of binaries that we could layer on top of sacred and profane. So Alexander is concerned with discourse. Goffman is concerned with the substantive content of interaction. Goffman limits his analysis to co-presence, whereas with very little sense of narrative or how narrative structure might organize interaction. Cultural sociology is pretty inattentive to the dynamics of interaction, except for what we call big actors. So people on like someone like Trump on the stage, or Mark Carney, right, or a global leader speaking, right? That sort of dynamics of that kind of interaction, but not everyday interaction. Goffman is concerned with everyday goings on, while cultural sociology has a grand view of performance, like those big political actors. Cultural sociology seeks to be explanatory, while Goffman is largely descriptive and interpretive. These are slightly clumsy sort of distinctions to make, but just I'll make them stronger than perhaps they are in the work. Then in terms of overlaps, they're both, as I've said, founded in Durkheim. They're both concerned with the interpretation of action and context, and then they both employ the same analytic strategy. For Goffman, the analytic strategy is to give the interaction order analytic autonomy, treat it as a world in its own right. Let's study us here. Let's not worry about the fact that we're at an institution in a province with limited funding, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. There's, we're on the brink of global conflict, whatever Goffman says, well, let's see what happens in here. And we might actually learn about that stuff by studying what happens in here, right? We might get a lens on it, but let's concern ourselves with what happens when humans are co-present. So that's the strategy of analytic autonomy for Goffman, whereas in cultural sociology, the idea is to treat culture, in particular, say, binary discourse, sacred and profane, their relative autonomy in shaping actions and institutions, providing inputs every bit as vital as more material or instrumental force. So you've got this analytic autonomy. So then the kind of central concern in both cultural sociology and studies of the interaction order is how morality is put into action in the goings-on of social life, right? Whether they're at large-scale political politics or where we are right now, and how is solidarity done and undone, right? In whatever the context is that we're interested in studying. They both attend to social performance. Goffman in the kind of the performative model of the self. Alexander more in the performance of political elites often, right, or leaders, in particular the possibilities of failed performance. Failed performance is one where where a performer does not fuse with their audience, right? So where you don't win an audience, where the audience doesn't feel themselves to be represented, their values to be represented by what is spoken. Right? Skip the fourth one here, sorry. Social action involves demonstrable commitment to something supra-individual, something over and above the self, which we might also call solidarity. And in both cases of cultural sociology, various studies in cultural sociology, and in studies of the interaction order more broadly, the sacred is treated as central. Okay, so to the sacred then. So the sacred concerns demonstrable solidarity in the way that I like to think about it, at least, right, and inflected by these thinkers. And then I pose the second question because I pose the second point as a question, I guess, but I have an answer to it myself, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on it. Is it possible to disentangle the sacred and solidarity in a way that is sociologically intelligible? Right? I'm not sure. We'd have to have a very constrained, I think, view of what the sacred is to try and do that. Okay, and then since I promised some theses, but I'm not married to them. Maybe the sacred's foundation is first social, right? If you're a sociologist, you just have to say yes, I agree. You want to say that now? Yes, I know. The sacred is irreducible to materiality. That's sort of building on Durkheim, right? There's a layering of the material and the symbolic. If you like your phenomenology, the concept of appresentation can be helpful. When you see a thing, you already have an imagination of all of the things that are behind it and all of the things that it embodies that are not necessarily evident in the surface properties of a material object. The sacred is a locus of collectivization, a place, material, symbolic, of gathering and mutual engagement. Its most elementary form is the dyadic, although more recently I've begun to think that maybe it's triadic form. There's work in social cognition looking at triadic interaction. So that is interactions involving three parties, whether that is individuals or we can think about it in terms of groups, right? The triad is very important. Zimmel has an extended piece on where he talks about the triad, right? Triadic relations. We tend to think about interaction as the building block of society, right? Which is good, right? Zimmel kind of talks about triads, and he said, well, triads are interesting because you have possibilities for coalitions, 2 versus 1. You have possibility for mediation, judges, court cases, ceremony, right? Marriage ceremonies, right? You need a mediator. You need a third party, right? Civil war. Civil wars are usually promoted by a third party, right? It's usually civil wars are rarely just 2 parties at war. They're often fed by a third party, right? But I'm interested. Been thinking more recently about triadic relations. That kind of a foundational element of sociality is not just the building block of a one-on-one, but is that relationship is observed by a third. Right? This is quite a big thing in friendship studies, actually, the sociology of friendship. A guy called Danny Kaplan has kind of worked on this, on how a lot of what we do in interaction is about the performance of our relationship for a third, right? Whether that's conscious or not. Invoking the sacred is expressive, which I kind of touched on without using that language, and the sacred is solidarizing. Binaries not only invoke their opposite, the sacred already invokes the profane, but not only do they invoke it, but they're in a mutually constituting relationship. right? The sacred can't touch the profane. Okay, so, and I have a bunch of references if you're interested, but spare you that. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mervyn. That was fantastic. So we're going to open it up. We have about, gosh, a little under 15 minutes. Not that long, but that's okay for questions. If you are participating virtually, you can raise your hand. If you are here in person, you could, of course, raise your hand. And wait for the mic. That's right. So do we have any questions from the floor, virtual or co-present? I'll ask a question. Yeah, thanks so much, Mervyn. I mean, obviously, this is your and my bread and butter. So, I mean, I'm in a way, I was, yeah, I'm just going to try and ask you to speak probably on a question that I suspect you kind of don't think all that much about, and that, do you think there's a difference, and if so, how would you just sort of articulate it, between, say, the secular sacred and the religious sacred, and you can understand that in however you'd like. And that question, I guess, is also coming from thinking about how, from the perspective of, say, a cultural sociological account of the modern world, how the decline of religion, do you think, should be understood? The religion traditionally conceived. Because it likely isn't going to be in the sort of kind of evolutionary frame that you get in the division of labor, which is sort of a kind of clear modernization account. It's going to be something more symbolic. I'd be curious, just some thoughts.
Yeah. So not something I've given huge thought to. You know what I mean? As a non-sociologist of religion. What I would say, I guess, I don't think anything I've said is necessarily controversial for a person who's interested in the religious sacred, right? I think the constitution of religious sacred follows the same sort of pattern as I've done here, but what I've tried to do is show how what might appear to be a kind of a religious, might have its origins in the sociology of religion, can be thought about much more broadly as an analytic way into studying social life. So I think the secular sacred, as I've outlined, encompasses the religious sacred, let's say, potentially too, analytically at least. Though I think there might be something different about personal observance in religious ritual that might be a little different than sacred, right? Because you also have things like religion can provide pre-existing templates, right, for what is sacred. I mean, although that might be no different than socialization into a nation, becoming a citizen, right, for example. In terms of the sort of secularization thesis and the importance or what's replacing religion.
And what explains the decline? I mean, just what the, I mean, I don't expect you to have fully fleshed out thoughts on this, but it's more just, I'm curious, because in a way I want to know what Jeff thinks. I mean, in a way, I think Jeff Alexander has a somewhat how do I say, sort of non-cultural sociological account of the decline of religion. And I'd be curious sort of how we should understand that. I mean, in a way, you could say he has the opposite problem of secularization theorists, right? He's obsessed with sort of, he just kind of takes the decline of religion for granted and then goes about theorizing. Whereas they focus on the decline of religion and then take, what happens afterwards for granted. So it seems to me like there's maybe blind spots on both sides, and I'm trying to figure out how the cultural sociologist understands that.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to come up with an explanation for the decline of religion. But I think, I mean, there's sort of Durkheim has this idea about for a rule to work, you must not just feel yourself, and so you can think about this in terms of law, but also religious rule, right? Or for a law to work or for a rule to work, you must not just feel that it's an obligation. You must feel compelled. You must feel that it is a good in itself, you must feel that this is worth doing, not just because boss man says I must do it, right? So this sort of, it's like like an authoritarian leader demands respect. A good leader commands respect. It's like that sort of distinction, right? One feels once, I'll fall in line with this person because they represent something to me that is not just pure authority, right? Top-down authority. So, I mean, there might be something in there about decline of around secularization, maybe. I don't know, right? It's easy for Catholicism, maybe, right? Some might work for some religions better than others, maybe. I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know if I have more to say on that, really. But yeah, thanks. Good question.
Does anyone else?
No,
You have to wait for the mic. You don't exist. You don't exist.
So I'm going to ask you about something that I haven't thought about since graduate school. So a long time ago, and may not be capturing or even remembering the essence of the argument very well. But I kept thinking at some point you might mention Randall Collins and interaction ritual chains. And so I'm wondering if you might say a little bit about where that work on emotional energy and interaction ritual chains fits with the sacred secular.
Totally. That was in there, but because I didn't want to refer to my notes the whole time. Yeah. So, I mean, I would put Randall Collins very much in the Goffmanian tradition. He's a Durkheim. You can go Durkheim, Goffman, deeper Goffman to Collins, if you like, because he is fully dependent on co-presence. Right? The emotional energy is a function of people being co-present. Right? You can't have a ramping up of emotional energy without people co-present. And I think a lot of what happened during Goffman showed the relevance of Randall Collins' work. Right? The centrality of interaction ritual, the kind of fragmentation that we're dealing with in the wake. I mean, you don't have to be a functionalist or Durkheimian to see that the fragmentation, polarization we're dealing with in the wake of COVID, or that COVID produced and that we're dealing with, I really, as somebody who is like a theorist of co-presence, I really think that it's and then simultaneously the rediscovery. I have a 17-year-old daughter, so I've been going to a lot of music shows. The rediscovery of ritual among young people, of collective ritual, just ordinary things like that, is amazing. And people are behaving in ways that they used not behave at things because we lost a period of time when they might have been socialized into it, I think. Right. So I think the Collins stuff is very relevant in here, but Collins doesn't have in interaction ritual theory, he kind of says, oh, it happened at a small level, and then just a whole bunch of small things happen, and that makes the macro level happen. You're like, no, there has to be things like discourse. There has to be, there have to be kind of shared ideals that are instantiated here and here, but those two places might never be connected, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
right?
totally.
Like analytically, there's a ratcheting up issue, right?
Yeah. Well, and it kind of connects with, I think, Galen's question, because it's sort of like, in my mind, some of what explains the decline is this co-presence and, to connect with the idea of triads and like, does it matter if nobody is like witnessing or participating in your relationship? But thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Anyone else? Question?
My name's Chris Ross, and I'm a clinical psychologist of religion, and I was recently asked to supervise a major research paper on obsessional compulsive disorder and ritual.
Right.
It was a research paper, it wasn't research. But one of the things that came out of that is the absence with OCD of any kind of satisfaction. Whereas with religious performance, there's a compelling, but there's some satisfaction with that. And I wondered if you had any reflections on that.
I wonder if, so I know we use the term ritual in reference to OCD behavior. I mean, I don't know the technical terminology. I see a student compulsion, but a student, Anna Henry, is a student doing her PhD at Guelph, is online here, and she wrote a brilliant master's thesis on OCD and stigma, actually partly using Goffman, but and kind of self-advocacy among people who self-identify with OCD, online advocacy, very interesting. But I wouldn't use the word ritual. I guess while in lay terms we use the word ritual to refer to compulsive behaviors. I think I'm not sure if that's sociologically would meet the bar in terms of ritual being some sort of collective activity. I think, right? Yeah, that would be the thing. And then I guess this might be where the rubbing against religion gets interesting, because people do talk about kind of personal ritual in terms of how they engage in daily prayer, let's say, right? but I suspect that daily prayer needs to also find Sunday Mass, right, for it to feel like it's extra significant, maybe, I don't know, right? Yeah, to keep it going, right, to sustain it over time. And that might be the ritual belief part, the Durkheim part, but I'd be very interested to talk to you about that, yeah.
Okay,
yeah
thank
yeah,
you.
Yeah. Anyone else have a question? Isabel, do you want to unmute and?
Do you hear me? Yes,
Yeah.
okay. With this shift in contemporary religiosity, we often talk about the sacred being sort of relocated. And looking, for example, at rites of passage, let's take surrounding death. It used to be, you know, just to make it like a paradigm shift in very schematic terms, that the collective focus was on a sacred that was located, so to speak, outside in the other, you know, a divine transcendent order. And now it seems to be that there's a big shift in the sacred being relocated in the relationship with the other in a small alterity. So sacred being located in the relationality itself, in the bonds that are being experienced in the ritual. So it's kind of reduction from a vertical approach to more of a horizontal approach. Is this something that resonates with you, relational?
100%. 100%. So I would say this, I mean, anytime this is Durkheim doesn't quite say it explicitly, but I would say this is what's shared across all three sort of versions of the sacred that I've sort of outlined, is that the sacred is the relation between people. When we genuflect between the sacred, we're genuflecting to, when you genuflect to God, you're genuflecting in Durkheim's language, you're genuflecting to the collective, right? So I think you said death rituals, is that what you said at the start? Yes. So I mean, death rituals being, I mean, I'm Irish Catholic, so death rituals are, you know, a very important part of my life. And an Irish Catholic funeral is, the dead person is of course relevant, but is semi-irrelevant. It's really about showing up for the people who are left behind. It's a demonstration of the solidarity of the group, you know. So hundreds of people will show up to just an ordinary everyday person. You know, my uncle's mechanic came to my father's funeral. He introduced, you know, I'm like, that this is what, that's a literal form of mechanical solidarity maybe, right? But you know, so there's a sort of there's a way in which I think early sociologists from Durkheim on conceived of the sacred as merely a representation of the social relation, right, on whatever scale that might be. So a wedding ring is the representation of the relation between two, but it's also a signal to a third, right? So I think the sacred is always about the relational, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Isabel, for the question. I think we're going to...
Excuse me. If I might ask a question?
Yes, sure. I didn't realize. Yeah. Is that Morad?
Yes,
Yep.
Morad.
Please.
Thank you, Mervyn, for this interesting lecture. Correct me if I'm wrong. I understood from some of the slides you presented that the sacred is always related to social interaction. So does that mean that the sacred is excluded from individual ritual acts?
So I guess so maybe going back to answer to a previous question, is that the term ritual would automatically, for me at least sociologically, would need to involve more than one, right? It would have to be social. A ritual is a form of social action in the Max Weber sense. So it must be meaningfully oriented to the past, present, or anticipated actions of another, right? So if a ritual is to be a form of social action, it must always necessarily involve more than one. I don't know if sociologically the word ritual is correct in reference to a practice that somebody repeats, right? But if I'm repeating a practice, praying 5 times a day, facing Mecca, right? Let's say, I'm also doing that as a practice that I know I share with millions of other people, right? And that tethers me in some way to those millions of other people with whom I'm going to feel solidarity, right? It's because we have a shared conception of the sacred. So I would say the sacred is always, ritual is always about, ritual must involve a relationship, and the sacred is always representative in some way of a relationship, whether it's a tiny dyadic relationship or something on a broader scale.
Yes, it all.
Good question.
Oh, yeah. Well, in a way, maybe it speaks to an answer to the question, which is that I gave, or that I asked, which is I mean, in religious ritual, the other could be God or the divine. So there could be, you know, a non-human other that one sees oneself as co-present with, and one genuinely feels and believes oneself to be, which is interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it works for Weber, acts on the basis of
Yeah,
orients to that being if one believes in it, right? So,
but you wonder if Durkheim, I'd be curious how that could be developed from a Durkheimian perspective. Anyways,
somebody's done it for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure. All right. Well, we're gonna end it there. Thanks everyone here and at home. Thank you again. Let's give a round of applause to Dr. Morgan. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.